Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma, Daf Tet Vav. Okay, we have our 1 second. Today's daf is sponsored by the Hadran Women of Long Island in honor of their co-learner and friend Debbie Schreiber on the birth of her grandson this week. May the new arrival bring the family and the Jewish people much joy. Today's daf is sponsored by Sarah Borelowitz in honor of her new grandson, Amiaz, son of Tani and Moriah Sturman. The name Amiaz, Ami, my people and my nation, and Az, strength, might, and bravery, symbolizes the strength of our nation. And if we haven't talked about grandchildren enough, today's daf is sponsored by the Hadran Zoom family. We're so happy to celebrate the birth of so many new grandchildren in this year, Tafshin Pei Daled, acronym for Tehei Shnat P'tichat Latot. This should be the year of opening new doors. Mazal Tov to Tina, Sarah, Phyllis, Tova, and anyone else we missed, Cain, Yirbu. Mazal Tov. Okay, with that happy note, nice to have happy things to celebrate these days, we will start on our daf. So I recommend you look at the study guide. It's a good chart in the beginning there about all the different things we've done in our Mishnah. We started with what Shum Kesef is, right? Then we had, right, Shum Kesef, you have to evaluate it in money, not in objects, barter, something like that. Shvei Kesef, it has to be paid in land, which then we said only really Yatomim, only from orphans can you only collect it in land. Bifnei Beit Din, has to be before a court. We said that is talking about that if you when you evaluate the damages, it has to be done in a court of experts, not just any 3 people you gather and call that a court, which can work for some things, but not for the damages. Al pi edim. So that's the one we were up to. We said al pi edim means that it's only if you're liable to pay the knasot, which we're going to talk a lot about today, fines, penalties, right? When it's not damages, but the knas, like for example, the double payment for theft. So that you only pay if there's witnesses, not if you admitted it. And then the question is, right, if I come and admit, so we know modeh b'knas is patur. So what's the Mishnah telling us? Well, what it's coming to teach us is if I came and admitted it in court and then witnesses came immediately, whether it's immediately after or sometime after, I'm not obligated to pay. And that's what it's telling you al pi edim. But we ended with a question, which was that's only if you hold that way. But some people actually think that if I came and admitted and then witnesses walked into court after that, I actually do have to pay because first of all, it could be I knew they were coming and therefore I just came and admitted to get out of it. Right? And for whatever other reason they hold that way, and therefore you can't read the Mishnah that way. So what's the al pi edim coming to explain? Well, last words of Yudalad Amabet, Seifa Yitztrichani. They need it for the continuation, meaning al pi edim is not a term in and of itself. It's al pi edim b'nei cholim b'nei brit. It's just the beginning of the next phrase. In other words, it's all one phrase. It means that the witnesses have to be, you can get convicted in a court by witnesses who are Jewish and free, meaning, okay, we're going to see now, B'nai Cholim, right? It means L'me'ute Avadim, free people, not Canaanite slaves. If they come and testify about a case of damages, we don't accept their testimony. And B'nai Brit L'me'ute Nocholim, we don't accept Gentile testimony in court. Again, this you have to remember, in those days, there was a lot of lack of trust between the Gentiles and the Jews, and therefore they weren't trustworthy in a court. Now, why do you need to mention both Avadim Knanim and Gentiles if theoretically Avadim Knanim are also Gentiles? So one would have been enough? Well, no. Sricha. The Mishnah needed to mention both. Why? Now, this is all a reference to a sugya we learned way back in Yevamot. You might or might not remember. Avadim don't go based on their parents' lineage, okay? We don't go by the father. There is no such thing. We don't associate it because we assume that, we have no idea who the woman had relations with. And therefore, that makes sense then that they're not accepted because they're, again, without good yichus, we already know from the last chapter of Kiddushin, if you learned it, right? Anyone with bad yichus is kind of at the bottom of the list here. We don't trust him. Aval nochli, the yeshlo yichus emalo, but a nochli is considered after the father. How do we know this? So Rashi quotes, in case you don't remember, as it says there in Yevamot, Hadriman ben Tavrimon ben Chazael. In the Tanakh, it talks about this character, Hadriman, and they say he's the son of Tavrimon, who's the son of Chazael. From there, you see that Gentiles do go lineage by their father. So you might have thought maybe they'll be accepted. Well, now what if you just had Nochri? So that you can't learn from Eved to Nochri because there's some advantage a Nochri has, a Gentile has over the slave. Because a slave, we don't connect things at all to their fathers, and therefore maybe we don't trust them in court. Again, the fact that those things go hand in hand, not so clear why, but again, it's just saying, like I said before, maybe they're just in a lower place in society. If you say Nochri, what's the advantage? We know already. The advantage of an Eved Knani is the Eved Knani is a pseudo-convert almost, right? They do a Brit Milah, they do a Tefillah before they become a slave, and they are obligated in certain mitzvot, right? They're exempt from the same time by mitzvot that women are exempt from, but otherwise they're part of mitzvot. So if you say Nochri, you would say Mishum de lo shayach b'mitzvot. They have nothing to do with our mitzvot. Aval Eved shayach b'mitzvot emalo, maybe you can accept their testimony in court. Sricha. That's why I need to tell you no. We don't accept Gentiles. We don't accept slaves. V'hanashim bichlal hanezik. This is what we call the shivyoni sugya. Okay, the one that puts women in the exact same place as men. Okay, as opposed to many sugyot which don't. For these issues, and we're going to see, they're even going to add more. Women are like men. So that means nashim bichlal hanezik. It means a woman who damages is liable to pay, and a woman who is damaged also gets payment. Now, you might think this is obvious, but they want to say menane mile because there's so many times where women are not part of the same, rule the same in the mitzvah. So now we're going to say, where do we get this from? And actually, it's a bit of a strange structure. They're going to bring 3 different psukim, which, okay, that's not strange at all. Then the Gemara is going to say, why did you need all 3? What do you learn from each one? What's strange about it is the Gemara asks the question, how do we know that women are both liable to pay for damages? And if they're damaged, they get paid compensation, which is a good question. The Gemara is going to answer. The first answer has nothing to do with the question. The first answer is going to say women are the same as men for something else. Then they're going to bring the second 2 sources have to do with our topic. So it seems like maybe they copied and pasted a sugya from a different place that talked about 3 areas where we see that men and women are equal, and 2 of them relate to our topic, even though the first one doesn't. So Manani, where do we get this from? To which the answer, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav Tana Deber Rav Yeshua. By the way, I didn't look this up, but you see it. The same sugya appears in Pesachim, it appears in Sukkah, it appears in Yivamot and Kiddushin and Tmura and Nida. So my theory that this was kind of copy and pasted is very likely. You have to look at them all there, but I assume that they appear there the same. So Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rav, Tana Deber Rabbi Yishmael, and also a braita from the house of Rabbi Yishmael. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Ish o isha ki asu mikol chato. Okay, this is a person who sins, and they have to bring a sin offering if it was unwitting. Hishva katuv isha leish l'chol anashim shebetorah. Notice it says a man or a woman. So here you see, men and women are equal for punishments. Now that's not what we're talking about, because paying damage isn't a punishment. I mean, of course it is, but it's a compensation. It's not in the world of onashim. It's in the world of mamonot, of paying back people for something you caused a loss for. But onashim are sacrifices, lashes, death by the court, all that. So it's saying for all kinds of punishments, if women did something wrong that's deserving of the punishment, they're going to get punished the same way if they were a man. Right? Maybe you don't want this kind of equality, but yes. Although I should say, kapara, atonement is important, right? You might not want the punishment. On the other hand, the punishment atones. So there's something valuable in it. This is source number 2, and this is the one that relates to us. Right after they got the Torah, it then starts Parshat Mishpatim. Eila HaMishpatim, these are the laws Asher Tasim Lifnehem, that you will put before them. Who's before them? Well, before them is men and women. Now one could say, what do you mean? It's masculine. Maybe it didn't mean the women, right? Many times there's these things that are said in the masculine form, which in the Hebrew language does include men and women, but the Torah will, the rabbis will say, oh no, that's only men, not women. But the explanation here is that it came right after Har Sinai. Now, who stood at Har Sinai? Men and women. So it was relating to all of the people who just got the Torah, which would include the women as well. So it's pretty clear women are included here. And obviously, Rabbi Elazar brings a braita that says it. This is Parshat Mishpatim. What is Mishpatim? Dinim. What are dinim? Laws, but specifically monetary laws. That's where all of our topics come in. The shore that gores, the shore that ate, the shore that trampled, all those, the boar, all of that is here. That's where you see that they're liable as well. And now we have to get to, how do you know if you injure a woman that you're responsible? Amar Kra behemit ish o isha. This is the pasuk that says, if a shore gores, if an ox gores a person, and it says ish o isha again. Notice source number 1 and source number 3 both say it very clearly, a man or a woman. The middle source said before them, which again, we understood to mean both, but it wasn't as clear. Anyway, I'm just pointing that out. Not that there's any meaning to what I'm, any relevance, but I'm just pointing it out as a difference. But in any case, kills a man or a woman, and then we say, right, the shore gets stoned. the person's supposed to die. Instead, they pay a ransom payment. So, right, the owner of the shore that killed this person, and if you kill a man or a woman, they're obviously valued the same. Now, I said in the beginning, this is like the sugya about equality. It's showing this is how men and women are all equal. Now, the next part is going to say, and I want to preface it by saying, it's not that they really believe what they're going to suggest right now, but the Gemara wants to do right now is say, why do we need 3 different verses? Why couldn't we have just learned one from the other? And whenever you do that kind of thing, you have to come up with what somebody might have thought. Now, just because they say somebody might have thought it, don't get convinced like, oh, they really believe this. I don't think they really believe it. What they're doing is they're coming from looking at the situation. The Torah mentioned this 3 times. Wouldn't it just be obvious to say it once and then we just understand men are like women for anything that has to do with, all of these topics? So they're going to say no, because if you had this one, you would have thought that. If you had that one, you would have thought that. And I charted this all out. You can follow in the chart if you want. But don't get too hung up about the suggestions they suggest, because they're a little bit strange and not so equal, right? Because what their whole point is, they're trying to come and say, well, you might have thought it wouldn't be equal, but it is. Okay, so utsriche. So again, this is all just what we call, acrobatics. The rabbis are trying to come up with what could we possibly think? What could people have thought to basically make it that, oh, that's why the Torah had to make it clear. No, don't think that. So tzricha, you need it. What? If you just had the first one was all about punishments. You might have thought, which again, punishments is equated with atonement. Well, the Torah had rachmanut, rachmanus, right? They pitied women and they said, oh, well, we want to allow women to have the opportunity to be atoned for also. So let's allow them atonement. Aval dinim, but when it comes to monetary law, maybe we don't need to make them pay. Why? Ish debar masal matan in isha lo. Well, you might say, look, the men do all the business. In those days, very few women were involved in business. They were mostly in the house. So men are the ones involved in business, and therefore there's a set of laws. If you're not really involved in business and you do business once in a while or something happens, we're not going to make you responsible. The Yashmin and Dinim, again, obviously we are, and that's why they need to tell you. Yashmin and Dinim, now here's a good theory to think that maybe only monetary law. It's the opposite, right? We're basically, that's why I call this acrobatics. First, we tried to convince that one was more obvious than this one. Now we're going to have to say this one was more obvious than that one. If you just had monetary law, you would say, well, women need to live in society, okay? Even though, right, women were in the home, but they still need to be part of society. Now, imagine that women were exempt from all sorts of monetary laws. So if you were doing a business deal with a woman, you would say, I'm not doing that. If she can't be brought to court for this because we don't have women in monetary laws, well, they'd say, well, I'm not doing business with her, right? It would put women in a very difficult place in society, because if they owned, okay, I see you say they didn't really have their own money, but they did. There were some cases where they did have their own money. First of all, take a woman who's not married, take a woman who inherited something, and then she inherited animals, and then her livestock goes out and attacks someone. Now it depends. Again, if she's still married, right? She could be divorced. All sorts of things could be. There could be situations. No one would want us to live with her. They'd be like, I'm not going to be your neighbor. Your ox is going to come into my thing, damage, and you're not going to have to pay. But maybe when it comes to atonement, okay, now wait, men are obligated in more mitzvot than women, right? Because women have some exemptions. Again, it's very strange because the exemptions are in positive commandments, and here we're talking about negative commandments. So the whole theory, the whole suggestion is a little bit strange, but because men are more involved in mitzvot, they have more mitzvot to do, maybe they therefore get the atonement. But the women, maybe they don't get atonement because they're not really part of mitzvot the way men are. Again, what the connection is a little hard to understand. But again, they're just trying to come up with some sort of pull at strings to come up with something why you might not have thought it. Because again, they're dealing with the fact that the Torah says it 3 times. So why did the Torah have to say it 3 times? Okay, well, let's say you have dinim and you have damages. Why do you need the third one? Right? You could have learned that, okay, obviously if someone damages a woman, they're going to have to pay. Well, you might have thought, the first is atonement, which obviously doesn't relate to a woman who gets killed or a woman who gets injured, right? Or her shore gets injured. And this is so she could survive in the community and people won't look down at her and say, hey, you're not paying what you're supposed to pay for. But this is the reverse. It's paying her. So that's not relevant. Avalinyan katla, but if she gets killed, ish debar. Now here again, this is very hard to fathom. Someone would think this, but ish debar mitzvah l'shalim kofer isha lo. But maybe if you kill a woman, well, maybe only if it's a man you have to pay ransom. But if you kill a woman, you wouldn't have to pay the ransom payment. Again, it's a little ridiculous to think what a value of a woman is different, and obviously they're going to now do the reverse logic. So don't get too worried about this. Let's say you just had the last one. Let's say you just had the ransom payment. Okay, what we did now is the first two, you couldn't learn the third. What if we just had the third? Maybe you could have learned the other two. So say, no, you would have said, there's a loss of life. Loss of life, should it matter man or woman, so that we get man and women are equal. But maybe, but then you might have thought, well, maybe she's not liable to pay damages, and maybe she's not liable she doesn't bring a korban, a sacrifice for atonement. Maybe it's only just that her life is equal to his. So if you kill her, you're going to have to pay damages, but maybe not the other things. So tzricha. And that's why in the end you need all three, because you couldn't really learn one from the other, or two to the third, or one to the two, etc. Okay, now we're going to have an interesting structure of the Gemara, because what we want to do is first we want to understand, it's a very strange line. It's the last line of our Mishnah. Both the one damaged and the one who damages pay. That's a little weird. The one who gets damaged gets paid. He doesn't pay, or she doesn't pay. So what are we talking about here? But before they understand, this is why it's a bit of a strange structure, before they get to what this Mishnah means, we're going to bring up a totally different sugya. And then we're going to have a machloket between Rav Papa and Rav Huna Berei Rav Yoshua about chatzi nezek payment in general. Then we're going to try to prove Rav Papa's point in 4 different ways. And the first way we're going to do it is to say our Mishnah makes a lot more sense according to Rav Papa. And then they're going to say, oh no, we can explain the Mishnah also according to Rav Huna. And then what we've done, right, through this other sugya is get to understanding what our Mishnah is, 2 different readings. Okay, that's the structure. So let's start. Itmar. Palganiska. So chatzi nezek. We know, okay, let's go back. A shore damages, right, gores another ox or a person, whatever it might be, causes damage. Now, the owner of this ox, if the ox has never done this before or hasn't done it 3 times yet, the shore is called a shore tam. This is unexpected damages, and therefore you only pay half. Now, what does it mean you only pay half? Well, what's this half payment? Okay, first of all, half could be half full, half empty. We're going to talk about this option. So let's just start with, and then you'll understand. Palganiska. What's the nature of this chatzi nezek payment? Okay, once the shore is a shore mu'ad, you pay full damages, you pay the damage you caused. Why are we only paying half the damages? So Rav Papa Amar Mamona, Rav Huna Berei Rav Yoshua Amar Knasa. There's a very basic debate here, and this is going to take us till the end, till the next Mishnah at the bottom of Amud Bet. It's a basic machlok. Is this a penalty payment? Meaning you're not really obligated to pay by law, but the rabbi said, or the Torah said, you have to pay. Or is it a monetary payment? Well, if it's a monetary payment, you should pay full damages, but somehow we cut it to half. So that's why I say, is it half full or half empty? Do you really owe 0 and we're making you pay half? Or do you really owe full and we're only making you pay half? So that's a different way of approaching. And then there's all sorts of ramifications if it's knas. We already saw one ramification, that if you admit it, that you did something, then you wouldn't have to pay at all. If my shore, right, gored yours, and it was unexpected, it was a short time, if I come and admit it in court and we say it's knas, then I don't have to pay. If it's mammon, I'd have to pay. So that's one big nafkamina. Another nafkamina we're going to get to at the end of the daf is because when the whole center moved to Babylonia in the beginning of the time of the Amoraim, the rabbis ruled, and this is one of these things, the clashes between Israel and Babylonia, you can only give smicha in Israel. And the rabbis in Babylonia couldn't give smicha. Now, one of the ramifications of not having smicha, now what? There were rabbis all over, right? But there were rabbis without the proper smicha. And one of the things you can't do without the proper smicha is you can't judge in knas laws. You can't judge penalties. So if you say it's knas, then that means there's no chatzi nezek in Babylonia. Okay, that's a big deal. Or anywhere outside of Israel. So we'll get to that at the very end of the sugya. But now we want to see why one says it's mammon, why one says it's knas. Let's go to the theory. Rav Papa Amar Mamona, kasavam. Now, right, there's always these philosophical debates. Is man inherently evil? Is man inherently good? Right? And then just influenced by bad things along the way. So same thing about shvarim. Okay? Rav Papa holds, Stam Shvarim, Lav B'chezkat Shimor Kaime. They're not really protected beings, meaning animals are dangerous, okay? Oxen are dangerous. They're hazardous. Now, it's true, there's still this concept of a shor tam and shor mu'ad, but they are hazardous in their nature. Ubedinu de'ba'ay kule. Really? You have an ox, we assume your ox is going to gore. It's just that the Torah had rachamim on the owner. Because, if your ox has never done it before, it reminded me, my mother doesn't like dogs. She walked once in an alley and a dog passed on the other side and bit her. Okay. Now, of course, the owner said, my dog never bites. Now, of course, your dog never bites until your dog bites, but there is a reason why some people are scared, because sometimes it happens that a dog might bite. So that's really what this is saying. It's saying that really your dog might not bite, but the fact is dogs do bite sometimes. So it is a hazard. So if you're an owner, you really are responsible for damages for your dog, anything your dog does. However, the Torah said, since your dog never bit before and you weren't really expecting it, there's some sort of expectation, but you don't really think it's going to happen. So we'll be lenient on you and only make you pay half. So that's why it's mamon. You're compensating the other person, but you're only compensating them halfway. Rav Huna b'reit Rav Yoshua amar knasa. Why does he say it's just a penalty? Kasava, or a fine. Kasava stam sholim b'chezkat shimor kaime. No, dogs don't bite, oxen don't gore. It's just not expected. Ubedinu delo l'shalem klal, and therefore, if it happens once, twice, 3 times, we just assume it's a fluke, okay? And you really shouldn't have to pay at all. But since it does happen, the Torah said, you know what? We're going to make you pay half as a penalty so that you protect your ox from doing it or your dog from biting, right? So you have to have some sort of awareness. If you're not responsible at all, then there's no awareness. So that's a very interesting debate, okay? Based on a philosophical debate about the nature of animals and the responsibility of the owner toward the animal. So it's very fascinating because both say you pay half damages. The question is, how do you look at it? So now let's go back to our Mishnah. So what we're going to do now is we're going to bring 4 Mishnayot, some from Bava Kamma, some from Ketubot. And we're going to say these Mishnayot seem to support the fact that it's mamon, this chatzi nezek payment. So anizak v'mazik b'tashlumin, and it says, Bishlam alaman damar palgan is kamamona. Hainu dishayach nizak b'tashlumin. Well, now we understand what it means. If really you're deserving of full damages, right? So let's go back to Ruth and Naomi. Ruth's ox gores Naomi's ox. Naomi should get full damages. But what? The Torah said, you know what, Ruth, we're not going to make you fully responsible because it was only, right, it wasn't expected. So now, in other words, it was expected, but you weren't forewarned. So now it says, the mazik has to pay. They pay the half. And the nizak has to pay because she loses half, because she really is deserving, Naomi, of getting the full. But she only gets half, so that's her payment, so to speak, okay? And in the summary of the daf, I put it in quotes, right? It's like, it's not really a payment, but it's as if it's a payment because she's not getting the half that she deserves. So that makes perfect sense. But if you say half nezek is knas payment, if Naomi really deserves 0, and Ruth is paying her this half because the Torah said, you know what, even though you sure wasn't supposed to gore, we weren't expecting it, but you still have to protect your animals and make sure they don't damage. Well, Naomi's getting 50% more than she's actually deserving of. So how could you possibly say she's paying something? To which the Gemara says, and it reminds us of a previous sugya, Naomi pays on the depreciation. Remember the case? So the shore is worth 300 before it got gored, Naomi's shore. Then it's dead. Now the nevela is worth 100 because Ruth's ox gored it. Now, half damages, that's 100. So Ruth pays 100 because the difference between 300 and 100 is 200, and only half is 100. But if by the time they get to court, the nevela goes down in price to 80, then even though now the loss of Naomi is 220, which means she should get paid 110, she's only going to get paid 100. And that's the part that she's part of the tashlumi, because the pchat nevela is on her and Naomi. So which they say, wait, if you're going to say this is pchat nevela, don't you remember? Hatana leresha, we already learned it from the previous Mishnah. Why do we have 2 Mishnayot telling us the same law? If right now we're saying that according to the one who says knas, the way to read nizak v'mazik b'tashlumim means that the nizak has to take the depreciation of the animal, of the dead animal. Well, we already learned that in the previous Mishnah. Remember, it said tashlumei nezek. That taught us that Naomi has to deal with the nevela. She keeps it. She has to sell it. And we learned that also the depreciation is on her. So, we could say the previous Mishnah was talking about a shor muad, and this one was talking about a shor tam, and that way we resolve that you needed to say it in both cases. Now, why would you need to tell us there's prat nevela both in tam and both in muad? Well, this goes back to logic we said in general about it. Remember, what's the whole idea of prat nevela? That somehow the nizak takes on more responsibility, even though really they were the one damaged. So, you need the Mishnah to tell you both about a shor tam and about a shor muad. Why? And again, we're going to bring the same logic and then flip it. If you just had about shor tam that Naomi has to take on more responsibility of the depreciation to akate lo yaid, you could say we're not going to make Ruth responsible for it because again, her shor was a shor tam, wasn't expected. Avamuad emalo, but then you would say once her shor gored 3 times, maybe Ruth has to take on more responsibility and even the depreciation. But that's why they tell you no. That's why you need a mission to tell you it's not true. If we knew the law was by muad, Ruth had to take on the extra depreciation as the one who damaged. Mishum de kamashalim kulet. Well, that's because that Naomi would have to take on the depreciation in a muad case. That's because Naomi's already paying. Ruth is already paying full damages. If Ruth is paying full damages, so yeah, Naomi will take a little bit of the loss, which is the prat nevela. Aval tam emalo. But in the case where Naomi is not even getting her full damages, maybe we'll make Ruth responsible for the depreciation. And that's why you needed it to be said in both cases. So that was source number 1. Again, this is brought in the sugya for a different reason. It's brought, really, we wanted to just explain what our Mishnah meant. But the way to explain what our Mishnah meant came up in this long discussion about is chatzi nezek knas or is it mamon? And the first attempt to prove Rav Papa's right, we said our Mishnah works a lot more according to him, but then we explained our Mishnah according to Rav Huna as well. Again, which meant hamazik v'nizak b'tashlumim. If chatzi nezek is mamon, then it makes sense because basically Naomi's paying half because she's not getting half the amount that she's deserving of. If she's deserving of nothing, then the loss she incurs is the depreciation of the nevela. And the fact that it was also mentioned in the previous Mishnah shouldn't bother us. One is shor tam, one is shor muad, and we just proved why you need both. Second source, Tashma. Ma ben tam lemuad. Okay, this is the next Mishnah. Is it the next one or is it the next one? No. Yeah, it's the next Mishnah. We're going to see it on tomorrow's daf. Ma ben tam lemuad. What's the difference between a shor tam and a shor muad? And the answer is shatam mashalem chatzi nezek migufo, umuad mashalem nezek shalem mina aliyah. Okay, these are differences. You pay half damages from the body of the animal versus full damages from not only the body of the animal, but you even pay more if there's more damage. Okay, we'll talk about that in tomorrow's daf. But the point being, what doesn't it say there? In Ita, if there really was a difference of knas and mamon, then there's a big difference between shor tam and shor muad that's not mentioned. Litnei nami ha. You would have said this. Tam eino mashalem al pi atzmo. If you admit it in court, since it's a knas, you don't have to pay for shor tam. And muad, if there's no witnesses and you can't admit it in court that you're sure damaged the other one, of course you'd have to pay because that's mamon. So muad mashalem al pi atzmo. So the fact that it doesn't say this must mean it's mamon and it's not a difference. Otherwise, it would have listed it with the differences. So now the Gemara wants to explain according to the one who says it's knas, according to Rav Huna. How would you explain this? Well, Tana v'Shiur. The Tana just left it off the list. I've seen this many times, right? Well, my shiur, the high shiur, if you're going to say left it off the list, well, you have to say there's other things left off the list as well. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. They only left off one item. To which they say, yeah, there is another one. Shiur chatzi kofer. Okay, this is when you have to pay this ransom payment. If you're sure gores another, kills a person, you have to pay, right? The Baalim really should die because they caused the death of someone, but since they didn't do it directly, they pay a ransom. But if your shor is a short time, you don't pay chatzi kofer. There is no ransom payment if the shor was a short time. So, imishum chatzi kofer lav shiurahu. Hamane Rabbi Yossi Glili hidamar tam mishalem chatzi kofer. They now say what you wanted to say. They just left off the knas issue and the admitting it, and because they left off this other thing about chatzi kofer, which is also a difference. You don't pay the kofer at all if it's a short time. But they said that's not a good proof, that's not a good answer, because it's very possible the Mishnah holds like Rabbi Yossi Aglili, who holds there is chatzi kofer. We now see it's a machloket. Some Rabbi Yossi Aglili thinks you do have to pay that half ransom payment if it was a short time to kill the person. So then it's not left off the list because it doesn't belong in the list because it's the same. It's chatzi versus whole, and that's all one and the same. So then we don't really have a good answer according to Rav Huna. Why did you say, right? How do you read that Mishnah? Chatzi nezek is knas. It should have been listed in the differences between tam and muad. Tashma, third source. Hemit shori et ploni. This is a Mishnah. We're now turning to Amud Bet. This is a Mishnah in Ketubot. Why is it in Ketubot? Because in Ketubot, we talked about the ones and mefata and all those things that were knas payments. So this is going to talk about knas payments. Okay, now, again, we're going to talk about mishalem al piatzmo, which means if you admit it in court, you have to pay if it's mammon. You don't have to pay if it's knas, right? If it's compensation versus a penalty. So, hemit shori et ploni. I come to court and I say, or let's go with our Ruth and Naomi. Ruth comes to court and says, my shur killed a person, or shorel shaploni, or my shur, right? So my shur either killed someone in Naomi's family, or my shur killed an ox of Naomi's. She'd have to pay. Now, what does this prove? Well, they didn't distinguish tam and muad, so therefore we're going to assume my lav betam, is this not also a short tam? And then if you have to pay, that means it's a monetary payment, proof for Rav Papa. To which they say, no, b'muad. You could say it's talking about only a short muad. And the short time, you wouldn't have to. So now they say, but wait, look at the continuation of that Mishnah. The continuation of the Mishnah says, okay, aval tamai. You're going to now say, okay, so according to what you're saying, we want to now explain the Mishnah according to Rav Huna, tamai, hachanami de emishalim al piatzmo. So you're going to say, if it was a tam, and Ruth comes and says, my short tam gored and killed a person or killed a shor, you don't have to pay. Well, ihachi adatani seifa. Well, then the structure of the Mishnah makes no sense, because the Mishnah started with a case where you do pay by admission, and it ended with a case where you don't pay by admitting. Now, what was the case here? Now, the assumption is going to be here, not what it says, but what it doesn't say. Since it already set up, this time you pay, and this time you don't pay, if the distinction was shor muad, you pay, short time, you don't pay, then the second part should have added short time to the list, and it doesn't. So listen, adatani seifa, it says in the end there, hey, meet shoriat avdo shel ploni. Now remember, for an eved, it's knas. Why is it knas? Because the Torah sets a sum. It's not based on what the person's slave was worth. If the person owned the Canaanite slave and your shor killed it, we pay, the owner has to pay 30 shkalim. Whether the eved, the slave was worth 40 or the slave was worth 20, it doesn't matter. That's clearly a knas payment, because when there's a set amount in the Torah, that's knas. So if so again, the beginning was, this is when you do pay by admission, and this is where you don't pay by admission. Again, assuming there were no witnesses. So now they say, if they're already distinguishing between a case where you do pay and a case where you don't pay, then the obvious, if short time doesn't pay by admission, it should have said like this in the Mishnah. Should have distinguished in the Mishnah already and mentioned that. When do we say you don't have to pay? You have to pay the full, even if you just admitted and there's no witnesses. B'muad, with a shor muad. Aval b'tam eino mishalem al piatzmo. And it should have then said tam eino mishalem al piatzmo, right? And right, once it said, but if it's an eved, no, and if it's tam, also you wouldn't pay. So the fact that it doesn't say, it seems like it's probably not the case. And then we're back to saying it's mammon. And that's why it didn't mention it, because there's no difference. So now they say, no, you could just say kula b'muad kamaire. The whole Mishnah there was just talking about a shor muad, whether a shor muad kills a person or a shor muad kills a slave. And it wasn't relating it all to a short time. And that's why I didn't mention the short time. Just because something's not mentioned could mean that just wasn't the topic they were dealing with. And that's a different way of resolving it, which then could explain this Mishnah according to Rav Huna also, that it's knas. Fourth source, Tashma. Zehaklal. This is the continuation of that Mishnah in Ketubot. This is the rule. Kol mishalem yotel. Now they want to know, what's the general rule of when do we know it's knas, when do we know it's mama? Kol mishalem yotel amashizik eno mishalem al piatzmo. If you have to pay more than what it costs, like for example, kefel, the double payment, that's more than the damage you caused. You stole one item, you have to pay the value of two. So that's knas, okay? And then you wouldn't pay by admission. Now, so that means only when it's more. Now, chatzi nezek is obviously less. So it must be chatzi nezek is mammon, it's not knas, because it's not included in this general rule. This says only more. To which the Gemara says, no, you want to explain according to Rav Huna? I'll explain it according to Rav Huna. My lab hapachot mima shehizik mishalem. Lo, kama shehizik mishalem. Right? You want to say, or you could, the truth is you could You can read it better. I'll read it. You can read it in two ways. I'll read it like this. My lav is the explanation for how we know this is mamon. Does this not mean pachot mimashi yazik? You would, if you're paying less than the damage, then that would be, you would have to pay it if you admitted it in court, which equals it's a mamon payment, it's monetary compensation, to which the Gemara rejects and now explains it according to Rav Huna, lo, ha kama shehizik mishalem. When it says if you paid more, it means more or less. In other words, only when you pay the exact amount of what it's worth is it a monetary compensation. Anything more or less would be a knas payment. And then you wouldn't pay it if you just admitted it in court. So now they say, wait, that doesn't work with the words. So if it's less, you're not going to have to pay. Well, then the wording doesn't make sense. It says the rule is anyone who pays more. If you wanted it to say more or less, it should have said litni zahaklal. Should have said this is the rule. As long as you're not paying the exact amount of what you damaged, then it comes into the category of knas. That would be a much clearer language because then it sounds like more or less. So your theory that even less is going to be knas, which is the way we're trying to explain Rav Huna in this source, doesn't really work. In fact, the Gemara answers to you that this, in fact, is difficult. So we have this difficulty on this interpretation of, so if you look at and you can see this in the chart because you can see where they said, right, in the end, two of them kind of could work according to Rav Huna, and two of them don't really work so well according to Rav Huna. Okay, so it does seem more on the side of it's a mamon payment. However, v'hilchata palga nizka knasa, but the halacha is half nezek is knas. And the Gemara says tiyuv to v'hilchata, but we just ended with a question, and this source didn't make any sense according to that opinion. So how could you possibly say that's the halacha if it doesn't fit in with that source we just saw with that Mishnah? To which they answer no, it does work. Tama might have a tiyuvta. Your whole problem with explaining that last source was mishum delo katane kimoshisi, right? It didn't say exactly as it was damaged. But the reason is lo psikale, kevan deika chatzin nezek stroro delchata gamirale de gamamanu mishum hachi lo katane. Well, they wanted to say things that are clear in all cases. Anytime it's more, for sure it's knas. Anytime it's less, it could be knas, like chatzin nezek. But there's a different chatzin nezek, which is not knas. What's that? Chatzin nezek stroro. That's when the animal kicks rocks and the rocks damage something else. Like I said, we'll see this more in depth later. But it's halacha hilchata gemirale. That means it's halacha lamosh misinai, that you have to pay chatzin nezek in that case. And mamonahu. And we know that that's a mamon payment. There's two ways to read this line. Some people say it's halacha lamosh misinai that it's mamon. But some people say, no, it's halacha lamosh misinai that you have to pay half damages. And it's clear that we're only just exempting you from half, but really you're supposed to pay the full thing. And it's a mamon compensation payment. That's why it didn't say more or less, because less sometimes is knas, sometimes isn't. So it's not a good litmus test. Okay. And that's the Gemara's answer as to, that's really not so difficult then in the end, that source. Now, here comes the big deal by saying it's knas. Hashad amar palga nizka knasa. Now that you said chatzin nezek is knas, and we live in Babylonia, and you can't rules about knas in Babylonia. So hi kal b'dachel imra, if you have a dog who eats a lamb, which is very rare, right? It's an atypical damage because we're looking for atypical damages. Now, eating is normally shame, but as soon as it's atypical, it goes into keren. Or shunra da'achla tarnagola, a cat that eats a rooster. Mishunehu, that's strange. V'lo magvina b'Babel, then you're not going to be able to collect damages in Babylonia. So what are you going to do? So first they say, first of all, we're going to define what's typical and what's atypical. If it's a big animal, it's atypical. If it's small, very small lamb, a teeny baby lamb, or a little rooster, then yes, it will be regular damages and you'll pay. Number two, itafas lamafkinamini. If the mazik if the niza, the one who got damaged, already grabbed the payment. Okay, now this Tosafot says it can't just be grab something of yours. Let's say, right, Naomi grabbed something of Ruth's, but if, let's say, Ruth's dog ate her lamb, she could grab the dog in compensation for the payment. If she grabbed the dog and took the law into her own hands, then we don't take it out of her hands. Tosafot says if we don't say it's the dog, then it could get out of hand. Now we could claim all sorts of things and there'd be no limit and it would be a problem. So, and she would take way more than damage. So you have to be, Tosafot's basically saying we have to be very cautious about people taking the law into their own hands. Now, Naomi can also say to the court, listen, I want to meet Ruth in court in Israel, where they can rule on me, rule us like that. So they can insist and give Naomi a subpoena that she's got to show up in Israel. Below Azil, if she doesn't show up, we can excommunicate her. Now, here's a added line before we get to the next Mishnah. Either which way we put Ruth in nidoy, excommunication, until she gets rid of the danger, which either means killing the animal or, injecting them with something to calm them down, somehow fixing the problem, or putting them in a cage forever, something. Mida Rabbi Natan, because we learned this from Rabbi Natan, fascinating. Braita de Tanya Rabbi Natan, Omer minayin shelo yigadel adam kelev ra b'toch beito. You can't have a bad and evil dog in your house. Va'al yamid sulam ra'ua b'toch beito. You can't leave a ladder that's broken in your house, right? Any kind of hazard that could cause someone to get injured. Talmud lomar lo tasim damim bebeitecha. That's what it means. Don't bring blood into your house. Don't be responsible indirectly for the death of somebody else. Very important law. Okay, Mishnah. I'm going to read the Mishnah in one way, although tomorrow's daf is going to reinterpret how to read this Mishnah. But the simple reading sounds like there's 5 cases of shor tam, 5 cases of shor mu'ad. What is that? Habeima ina mu'ed, that is not expected to. Lo ligach, not to gore. Lo ligof, not to shove. Lo lishoch, not to bite. Lo lirbot, not to kick. And lo lirbot, to crouch on something. And lo livot, not to kick. Those are 5 tamim. Hashem mu'ed, that here come the 5 mu'adim. Hashem, when that means chatzi nezek, right? Obviously. Hashem mu'ed le'echol oila. Shem, normally they eat things. That's mu'ad, right? Food that they would generally eat. We're going to get to later what this is. Harega mu'ed l'shbor b'derech chilucha. Rega, we assume that as the animal walks, they trample things. This is good review for us. Shor mu'ad, number 3. Karen damage, that they've already done it 3 times. Shor hamazik b'reshut hanizak. If an animal damages, this means Karen. Karen damages in the house of, so Ruth's animal goes into Naomi's house and gores her in Naomi's house. This, by the way, we saw this already. This is Rabbi Tarfon's opinion. According to the rabbis, everyone agrees that in the public domain, you might remember this, Shane and Regal, you're not liable for, because what were you doing leaving your food there knowing that the animals do this? But Karen, it's unexpected. So in Rishut Rabim, everyone agrees it's half damages if it's a shor tam. But in the house, if the shor comes into your house and damages in your house, there's a debate. So even if it's unexpected, Rabbi Tarfon says you're liable full damages. And that's what this seems to be saying. If he's mazik in the house of the nizak, then you're liable full damages. It's true, my shor doesn't generally damage, but what are you doing bringing your shor into my house? According to the rabbis, no, it's still chatzi nezek because it wasn't expected. Okay, that's a big machloket, which we're going to get into a lot today, or really tomorrow. And ha'adam, number 5, is a person who damages. Then, even though it said 5, it now lists another 6. So it's a little bit strange. Okay, wolf, lion, bear, some sort of leopard, and a bardalas, which we'll talk in the Gemara what a bardalas is, perhaps a cheetah, perhaps a hyena. V'hanachash and the snake, they are forewarned from the beginning because they're dangerous animals. However, Rabbi Elazar if you keep them in your house as pets and you domesticate them, then they're not. I don't recommend necessarily having one of these in your house, but if you were, except for hanachash muad olam. But snakes are never. Even if you have a pet snake, they're still muad from the beginning. Okay, now comes the big question, which is going to really be dealt with much more tomorrow. We're going to have one explanation today. Now, there's an assumption here that if the Shane is talking about a particular case, the cases before must be in the same scenario. So let's just understand. Shane is mu'ad for eating. That means you're going to have to pay full damages. Now, where is that? The Mishnah must be talking about if it's in your property, because remember, if it's in the public domain, you're not responsible. And then look in the beginning. The first 5, we're assuming is in the same scenario when it's in the nizak's. Okay, they come in, Ruth's shore comes into Naomi's property and gores and does all these things. She's liable half damages. That's the beginning. But then, right, Mane Rabbanan, that's the rabbi's approach. Right, they pay off damages. But Ema Seifa, the end says, Shor Mu'ab, Shor Mazik, Berushat Tanizak, Ba'adam. Now they're really only referring to the Shor Mazik, Berushat Tanizak, which we just said Atan Rabbi Tarfon, even if it's atypical damages, if Ruth's store goes into Naomi's property, according to Rabbi Tarfon, you have to pay full damages. That's the last part of the Mishnah. So the first part of the Mishnah doesn't agree with the last part of the Mishnah. So Reisha Rabbanan, Sefer Rabbi Tarfon, it doesn't make sense that the first part of the Mishnah would be Rabbanan and the second part would be Rabbi Tarfon, to which the Gemara answers, that really doesn't bother us, and we saw this yesterday. Tahamar le Shmuel Rabbi Yehuda Shinana. Shmuel said to Rabbi Yehuda, "You wise child, shvok manitim b'tava, leave the Mishnah, don't be bothered by it, and follow me." Reisha Rabbanan v'sefer Rabbi Tarfon. The beginning is the rabbis, the end is Rabbi Tarfon. Don't be bothered by that. This Mishnah holds by two different opinions. That's the first answer, which is not really an answer. It's just saying don't let it bother you. But we're going to have three other explanations of this Mishnah in tomorrow's Daf. There's a good chart on the study guide tomorrow. If you're going to learn over Shabbat, you might want to print out the study guide. It'll help guide you through the Daf. Okay, this is it for today. Maybe I'll do a very quick summary. We started with explaining all the different cases in the previous Mishnah, what it meant, the Adim, the B'nai Brit, all that, the women, the equality of women and men for these issues, and the Nizak and the Mazik B'Tashlumim, which we got into a whole discussion through that of Knas and Mammon. Is Chatzi Nezek Knas or is it Mammon? That was our main discussion for today. And then we got into the Chamishat Tamim B'Chamisha Moadim. And like I said, this Mishnah has some issues with it, or one major issue. One part seems to match the rabbis, one part seems to match Rabbi Tarfon. We're going to have to figure out how to resolve this in a bunch of different ways. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom and hoping for a peaceful Shabbat.